Loper Martins, and I'm working on rape. The Latin word for rape is rapere, which means to take by force. Rape can be described as a non-consensual sexual intercourse inflicted on a person by either gender. It could be male on male, male on female, female on male, or female on female. The next slide talks about role of consent. Many states have different definitions, but consent plays a big role in deciding whether a scene is considered rape or not. And the other slide talks about affirmative consent. Generally, there are three main ways to consent, and it's analyzed in relation to sexual intercourse or activity. Affirmative consent has to do with words or actions indicating agreement for any sexual activities, and the pictures below shows or further explains it. The next slide talks about capacity to consent. If an individual either has the capacity to consent in terms of mental or physical ability, or if they have the legal ability in terms of age to consent to a sexual intercourse or act, then they have the capacity to consent. If not, it is considered rape. And the next slide talks about the third one, freely given consent. If the consent was compelled either by fraud, some sort of violence, some sort of threat, or some sort of coercion, then it is not a freely given consent, and that is considered rape as well. The next slide talks about age. The person must be at or the above age of consent for the state. As we know, as I said in the first definition, all different states have different consents or age of consent, so you have to be aware. And also, the difference between the victim and the perpetrator might affect the age of the consent of the state. So that's also something to keep in mind. And the next slide talks about intoxication. Different states have different definitions as well, but it matters it matters whether you voluntarily or involuntarily became intoxicated. I'm against this rule, as it could be a case of someone being having their drink being laced, and that led to them being raped. Like, you could have all intentions of wanting to drink, but you don't plan on getting your drinks laced. So I think that definition is wrong, but intoxication does lead to rape, so be aware. The next slide talks about physical disability. If a person has a form of physical disability and cannot physically restrain a perpetrator, then there is no form of consent, and this is also considered rape. The next slide talks about a vulnerable adult. If an adult is ill or unable to perform certain acts like walk, talk, or care for themselves, they have no way to affirmatively consent to any intercourse, and this is also rape. Next slide talks about unconsciousness. If the person is sleeping, suffering from some sort of physical trauma, or sedated, they cannot consent to any intercourse also, and this is also considered rape. And the next slide talks about developmental disability. If a person has any sort of mental incapacitation, I'd highly advise to avoid any sexual intercourse because they have no way of affirmatively com- uh, consenting, and this will also result in rape. The next slide talks about relationship of victim or the perpetrator. If the perpetrator is in a position of authority, and most cases this happens to be in the situation of an inmate and a cell guard, one that has higher power than the other, and the other is kind of compelled to do as they ask, this is also considered rape. Next slide talks about statutory rape. This one most people are familiar with, as we learn about it in high school and other stuff. But it refers to intercourse with a minor, someone below the age of consent. It differs for all states, as I say it again. But minors who are under the age of consent cannot convey to having sex. So even if they physically agree to it, it's still against the law. The next one talks about surveys about rape. And according to chapter 10, rape is a warm weather crime, meaning that most rape occurs in the summer. The survey showed it happens between June and August, and the lowest number happens between December and February, which is the winter. The next slide talks about anger rape. Anger rape has to do with an offender who is filled with rage and expresses his anger through sexually assaulting a victim and asserting more force than he or she usually would in any other regular situation. And the next one is power rage. Power rage has to do with an offender who goes to the extent of showing their authority either by restricting the movement of a victim, hitting and controlling them, biting, and other such. And the next is sadistic rape. This can both be power and anger rape, as it has to do with prolonged torture. The offender might not even make contact with his uh with his victim, but might use an instrument instead to inflict pain for his or her pleasure. The next one is date rape. Date rape is when a victim is assaulted sexually by someone they know. So yes, this occurs when people get raped by their significant others. It's common. It's not common for the significant other to go to the authority and make a complaint, but it is common. And also date rape drugs, they're mostly commonly used for sexual assault in a person, and they have no taste, no color, no smell. So you should be really careful with putting your drinks down at parties, leaving it unattended, and coming back to it. It's not safe at all, and I would not advise it. And the last slide talks about calling for help. There are many services for help nowadays, and National Sexual Assault Hotline is one. The number is 1-800-656-HOPE, 1-800-656-HOPE. And the next one is National Domestic Violence Hotline, and the number is 1-800-799-SAFE, 1-800-799-SAFE. And the third one I listed is Girls and Boys Town National Hotline, and the number for them is 1-800-448-3000, 1-800-448-3000. And other ways to help yourself and protect yourself from rape is learning self-defense, keeping pepper spray on you, and so forth. I hope we all learn from this, and thank you again.